She sat in the defendant's chair with perfect military posture, her dress blues immaculate despite the weight of accusations hanging over her head. Captain Morgan Ghost Harrison faced the court-martial with the same calm determination that had carried her through 9 years of classified operations. The judge's voice dripped with condescension as he stared down at her from his elevated bench. "You think you're special, Captain Harrison, but you're not. You're just another weak soldier who cracked under pressure." What happened next would silence the entire courtroom and destroy a corrupt judge's career in a matter of seconds. She leaned forward slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, and spoke 2 words that made hardened military officers freeze in disbelief. "Welcome to those who left a trace." Before we dive into this incredible story of courage, corruption, and the moment when truth finally prevailed, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who serve with unwavering integrity. The Naval Station Portsmouth courtroom carried the sterile authority of military justice. It's polished with paneling and brass fixtures, creating an atmosphere where careers were made and destroyed with the stroke of a pen. Captain Morgan Harrison sat with her hands folded on the defense table, her auburn hair pulled back in a regulation bun, green eyes fixed straight ahead with the kind of focus that came from years of operating in hostile territory. At 31 years old, Morgan had already lived 3 lifetimes' worth of experiences that would never appear in any official record. 9 years of military service had taken her to places that didn't exist on public maps, conducting operations that officially never happened. 2 tours in Yemen, 36 confirmed lives saved for classified metals that no one outside a select circle would ever know about. But none of that seemed to matter now as she faced charges that could end her career and send her to military prison. The court-martial had been in session for 3 days, and the prosecution's case seemed ironclad. Video evidence showed Operation Crimson Dawn unfolding in thermal imagery, satellite feeds displaying Morgan's team moving through a hostile compound in the mountains of Yemen. The mission had been a high-value target extraction, a terrorist leader whose capture could have prevented dozens of future attacks on American interests. But the operation had gone catastrophically wrong when Morgan made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. With her team in position and the target acquired, she had received intelligence that changed everything. Civilian families were being held in the same compound, including children who would become collateral damage if the operation proceeded as planned. Colonel Marcus Brennan stood at the prosecution table, his silver hair and decorated uniform commanding respect from everyone in the room except Morgan. She knew what he really was beneath the polished exterior, a career officer who had built his reputation on the backs of soldiers like her, taking credit for successful operations while distancing himself from anything that might threaten his advancement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," Brennan announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. Captain Harrison's actions on the night of September 15th represent a fundamental failure of military discipline. When ordered to proceed with the extraction, she hesitated. When ordered again, she refused. And when given a direct command by her superior officer, she committed the ultimate act of military disobedience. She abandoned the mission. The word hung in the air like accusations written in stone. In the gallery behind Morgan, she could see the faces of military personnel who had come to witness what they believed would be the downfall of a once promising officer. Some looked disappointed. Others satisfied that justice was finally being served. But Morgan knew the truth that none of them had been told. The intelligence about civilian presence hadn't come through official channels. It had come from a source she had developed over months of careful cultivation, a local informant whose information had saved American lives on multiple previous occasions. Acting on that intelligence would have meant revealing methods and sources that were classified beyond the clearance level of anyone in this courtroom. Major Lisa Chun, Morgan's defense attorney, sat beside her with an expression of barely contained frustration. Chun was a competent lawyer, but she was fighting with one hand tied behind her back. Morgan's complete service record remained classified, leaving Chin unable to establish the context of experience and judgment that had informed her client's decision. The defense maintains Chin had argued earlier that Captain Harrison acted within her authority as mission commander when faced with actionable intelligence regarding civilian casualties. Military law is clear that avoiding unnecessary harm to non-combatants takes precedence over mission objectives. Military law is also clear. Judge Advocate General Richard Sterling had replied from the bench that orders from superior officers are not suggestions to be evaluated by subordinates. Captain Harrison's personal feelings about potential civilian casualties do not supersede the operational authority of her command structure. Sterling was a man who wore his authority like armor, his face bearing the kind of hard angles that came from years of making decisions that affected other people's lives without having to live with the consequences himself. His record showed 25 years of military legal service, but Morgan had noticed something in his personnel file that the defense wasn't supposed to see. He had been involved in the legal oversight of Operation Sandcastle, a mission that had resulted in significant civilian casualties 3 years earlier. A mission that had been covered up to protect the careers of senior officers. Now, as the prosecution prepared to call its final witness, Morgan felt the weight of institutional pressure bearing down on her. This wasn't just about her alleged insubordination. This was about sending a message to other officers who might be tempted to put their conscience ahead of their orders. Colonel Brennan approached the witness stand with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness. The prosecution calls General Patricia Wells to testify about Captain Harrison's fitness for command. General Wells entered the courtroom with the bearing of someone who had earned her stars through decades of competent service. Her gray hair was pulled back severely, and her uniform bore decorations that spoke of a distinguished career in military intelligence. But as she took the oath and settled into the witness chair, Morgan noticed something in her eyes, a flicker of recognition that suggested Wells knew more about this case than her testimony would reveal. General Wells, Brennan began, you serve as operational oversight for Task Force Raven, the unit to which Captain Harrison was assigned during her deployment to Yemen. Is that correct? Yes, Colonel. I provided strategic guidance and mission authorization for Raven's operations in the region. And during that time, did you have occasion to observe Captain Harrison's performance and decision-making abilities? Wells paused for just a moment, her eyes finding Morgan's across the courtroom. Captain Harrison was an exemplary officer. Her tactical skills were exceptional, and her judgment under pressure was among the finest I've encountered in 30 years of service. The answer clearly wasn't what Brennan had expected. His composure slipped slightly as he adjusted his approach. General, are you familiar with the events of September 15th, when Captain Harrison refused a direct order to proceed with Operation Crimson Dawn? I am familiar with the official after-action report. Wells replied carefully. And based on that report, would you say Captain Harrison's actions represented sound military judgment? Wells was quiet for a long moment, and Morgan could see her weighing her words carefully. Colonel, military judgment must always be evaluated within the complete context of available information and operational constraints. It was a diplomatic non-answer, but Morgan caught the subtext. Wells was sending a message that there was more to the story than what appeared in the official records. General, Brennan pressed, let me ask you directly. In your opinion, was Captain Harrison justified in refusing to follow orders that night? Before Wells could answer, Major Chin rose from the defense table. Objection, Your Honor. The question asked for speculation about classified operational details that haven't been presented to this court. Judge Sterling's expression hardened. Overruled. The witness will answer the question. Wells looked directly at Morgan again, and this time the message in her eyes was unmistakable. She knew about the civilian intelligence. She knew about the impossible choice Morgan had been forced to make. But she also knew that revealing that information would compromise ongoing operations and endanger lives. Colonel Brennan, Wells said finally, I believe Captain Harrison acted according to her best understanding of the situation as it existed on the ground. Military commanders in combat zones must sometimes make decisions based on information that isn't available to higher headquarters. It was as close to vindication as Morgan was likely to get from an official witness, but she could see that Brennan wasn't finished. He had built his case on the foundation of military discipline and chain of command, and he wasn't going to let subtlety undermine his prosecution. General Wells, let me ask you about Captain Harrison's psychological fitness for command. Have you reviewed the psychiatric evaluation conducted by Dr. William Parker? Chun was on her feet immediately. Objection. The defense has not been provided with any psychiatric evaluation. The evaluation was ordered by this court as part of proceedings. Sterling ruled. It's admissible evidence. Morgan felt her stomach drop. A psychiatric evaluation that she hadn't been informed about, conducted without her knowledge or consent. It was an ambush designed to destroy her credibility and her career. Brennan produced a folder from his table and handed it to Wells. General, according to Dr. Parker's evaluation, Captain Harrison shows signs of what he terms mission paralysis, an inability to make decisive command decisions under stress. Does this assessment change your opinion of her fitness for military service? Wells opened the folder and began reading, her expression growing darker with each page. After several minutes, she looked up with something approaching anger in her eyes. Colonel, I've read Dr. Parker's evaluation, and I find it to be fundamentally flawed and potentially biased. Captain Harrison's service record shows exactly the opposite of what this report suggests. Her ability to make quick, accurate decisions under extreme pressure has saved American lives on multiple occasions. And yet, Brennan continued, she failed to make the decisive choice required during Operation Crimson Dawn. Instead of following orders, she froze. She didn't freeze, Colonel. She adapted to changing circumstances based on new intelligence. Intelligence that she has refused to share with this court or her chain of command. Wells closed the folder and set it aside. Some intelligence cannot be shared without compromising sources and methods that protect American lives. That a fundamental principle of military operations. The exchange was becoming heated, and Morgan could see that Brennan was losing control of his witness. But Judge Sterling seemed determined to steer the testimony back toward condemnation. General Wells, Sterling interjected, regardless of your personal opinion of Captain Harrison's service record, do you believe military discipline requires officers to follow lawful orders from their superiors? Of course, Your Honor. And Captain Harrison did not follow the order she received on September 15th? Wells hesitated. Trapped between her duty to support military discipline and her knowledge of the circumstances that had driven Morgan's decision. She did not follow those specific orders, no. Thank you, General. That will be all. As Wells stepped down from the witness stand, she passed close enough to the defense table to make eye contact with Morgan one more time. This time, her message was different. It was a look of regret, of apology for not being able to say more, and of something else, a warning that worse was coming. The final day of the court-martial began with an atmosphere of inevitability. The gallery was packed with senior officers, and Morgan noticed several faces she didn't recognize. Civilians in dark suits who watched the proceedings with the kind of attention that suggested professional interest rather than casual observation. Judge Sterling called the court to order with unusual formality, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there during the previous days. This court is prepared to hear closing arguments in the matter of the United States Navy versus Captain Morgan Harrison. Colonel Brennan, you may proceed. Brennan rose with the confidence of a man who believed victory was assured. He had built his case methodically over 3 days, establishing a clear narrative of insubordination and failed leadership. Now he would drive home the consequences. Members of the court, he began, the evidence in this case is overwhelming. Captain Harrison was given clear, direct orders during a critical military operation. She chose to ignore those orders based on her personal judgment rather than the established chain of command. This isn't about her service record or her past achievements. This is about fundamental military discipline. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. If we allow officers to pick and choose which orders they follow based on their personal assessment of the situation, we undermine the very foundation of military effectiveness. Captain Harrison's actions represent a dangerous precedent that cannot be tolerated. Brennan gestured toward Morgan, his voice rising with righteous indignation. She claimed she acted to prevent civilian casualties, but she has provided no evidence to support this claim. Instead, she asked this court to trust her judgment over that of her superiors, to accept her word over established military protocol. The prosecution's closing was exactly what Morgan had expected. Appeal to institutional authority that painted her as a rogue officer who threatened military order. But she also noticed something in Brennan's delivery that suggested he wasn't as confident as he appeared. His eyes kept flickering toward the civilians in the gallery, as if seeking approval or reassurance. When Brennan finished, Major Chin rose for the defense's closing argument. Despite the limitations placed on her case, she had done her best to present Morgan as a dedicated officer who had made a difficult decision under impossible circumstances. "Members of the court," Chin began, "Captain Harrison is not on trial for being insubordinate. She's on trial for being conscientious. The prosecution wants you to believe that military discipline requires blind obedience to orders regardless of circumstances. But military law, military ethics, and military tradition all recognize that officers have a duty to prevent unnecessary harm to innocent civilians." Chin walked closer to the court members, her voice carrying conviction. Captain Harrison had served with distinction for 9 years. She had never refused an order, never shown cowardice, never failed in her duty. Yet the prosecution wants you to believe that on this one night, she suddenly became a different person, someone who would abandon her mission and her teammates for no reason. She turned toward Morgan, her voice softening. Or perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps Captain Harrison made a command decision based on information and experience that saved innocent lives while still protecting American interests. Perhaps she demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage that we should expect from our military leaders. The closing arguments concluded, and Judge Sterling called a recess before rendering his verdict. As the courtroom emptied, Morgan sat alone at the defense table, knowing that her fate was now in the hands of people who had already decided her guilt. Major Chin approached with an expression of resignation. "Captain, I've done everything I could with the constraints we faced. But I want you to know that regardless of the verdict, you acted with honor and integrity." Morgan nodded, appreciating the sentiment even though it wouldn't change the outcome. "Thank you, Major. You've been more than I had any right to expect." When court reconvened 30 minutes later, the atmosphere had changed. The gallery was fuller than before, with new faces that Morgan didn't recognize. Senior officers who hadn't been present for the previous proceedings now occupied prominent seats, their expressions serious and attentive. Judge Sterling entered with unusual ceremony, his bearing suggesting the weight of the moment. But there was something else in his demeanor, a tension that hadn't been there before, as if he was operating under pressures that went beyond the evidence presented in court. "This court-martial is now in session," Sterling announced. "Having reviewed the evidence and heard the testimony, this court is prepared to render judgment in the matter of the United States Navy versus Captain Morgan Harrison." He shuffled papers before him, organizing his thoughts. Before the verdict is announced, military justice provides the defendant with an opportunity for final statement. "Captain Harrison, do you wish to address this court?" Morgan had prepared for this moment throughout the trial, crafting words that would maintain her dignity regardless of the outcome. But as she looked around the courtroom, at the officers who would judge her, at the civilians who watched her professional interest, at the defense attorney who had fought for her with limited resources, she made a different decision. She stood slowly, adjusting her dress blue jacket, and moved toward the microphone position before the bench. For a moment, she simply stood there, her posture shifting subtly as something predatory awakened in her bearing. The careful facade of a disciplined officer fell away, replaced by the presence of someone who had operated in shadows where official rules didn't apply. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a new edge, "I request permission to properly identify myself for the record." Sterling frowned, clearly annoyed by what he perceived as a delaying tactic. "Your name and rank are already established, Captain." "Not all of it, sir," Morgan replied, stepping closer to the microphone. "May I approach?" Sterling gestured his consent, and Morgan moved forward until she was directly in front of the bench. She looked up at the judge who had spent 3 days systematically destroying her reputation and career, and for the first time since the trial began, she smiled. Then she leaned toward the microphone and spoke just above a whisper, her words carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. Shadow protocol. The reaction was immediate and electric. A colonel in the third row dropped his briefcase, the sound echoing through the sudden silence. One of the civilians in dark suits stood abruptly, his hand moving toward a concealed communication device. In the front row, General Wells closed her eyes and shook her head slightly, as if she had been dreading this moment. But it was Judge Sterling's reaction that confirmed what Morgan had suspected all along. His face drained of color, his composure cracking for the first time during the proceedings. His eyes widened with something approaching terror as the implications of those two words sank in. "What did you say?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Morgan straightened to her full height, her voice stronger now. "Shadow Protocol, Your Honor. Task Force Phantom. November 2019 through March 2023. My clearance level is higher than yours. My mission authorization came from levels of government you've never had access to, and my service record contains operations that your security clearance doesn't qualify you to review." The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos. Officers throughout the gallery were on their phones, speaking in clipped, urgent phrases. The civilians in dark suits moved swiftly toward the exits, not to leave but to secure the room from outside interference. General Wells rose from her seat and approached the bench with the purposeful stride of someone who had been waiting for this moment. Sterling banged his gavel repeatedly, his voice rising to a shout. "This court will have order. Whatever game you're playing, Captain Harrison, it won't change the facts of this case." But even as he spoke, one of the dark-suited civilians approached the bench with a secure phone. Sterling's expression transformed in real time as he listened to whoever was on the other end. Confusion giving way to shock, then to something approaching panic. "This court will recess immediately," he announced, his voice unsteady. "All present will remain in the building pending further instructions." As Sterling fled to his chamber door, the courtroom dissolved into urgent conferences. Officers formed tight clusters, speaking in low tones about classification levels and need-to-know protocols. The civilians who had secured the room began checking credentials and establishing a perimeter that suggested this was no longer a routine legal proceeding. General Wells approached Morgan directly, ignoring military protocol and courtroom procedures. Instead of anger or confusion, there was recognition and respect in her eyes. "Captain," she said quietly, "it's been a long time since anyone invoked Shadow Protocol." "For years, 7 months, General," Morgan replied precisely. "Not since the Damascus extraction. We thought the program was permanently classified after the Senate investigation. Some operations are too important to stay buried, ma'am." The recess lasted 3 hours, during which the courthouse was effectively locked down by personnel whose authority superseded normal military channels. Morgan waited in a secure room with Major Chun, who sat in stunned silence as the implications of her client's revelation began to sink in. "You're not just a Navy SEAL, are you?" Chun finally asked. "I was never officially a SEAL, Major. That was my cover assignment while I operated with Shadow Protocol." "And Shadow Protocol is—" Morgan chose her words carefully. "A joint special operations program that handles missions requiring complete deniability. When American forces need to be somewhere they can't officially go, doing things that can't officially happen, Shadow Protocol provides a capability." Chun processed this information, understanding beginning to dawn. And Judge Sterling knew about this program? Judge Sterling was legal counsel for the Senate Intelligence Committee that investigated Shadow Protocol after the Damascus incident. He recommended that the program be disbanded and its records sealed. What he didn't know was that the program continued under different authorization. So when you invoked Shadow Protocol, I identified myself as someone whose actual authority and security clearance make this entire court-martial invalid. Sterling has been presiding over a case. He doesn't have the legal standing to judge. The door opened, and a woman in civilian clothes entered. She was in her 50s, with graying hair and the kind of presence that marked her as someone accustomed to operating at the highest levels of government. "Captain Harrison," she said, "I'm Director Sarah Vance, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations. We need to talk." They moved to a more secure conference room, where Vance spread a series of folders on the table. Unlike the sanitized personnel file that had been available to the court-martial, these documents told the complete story of Morgan's service. Captain, your invocation of Shadow Protocol has created a significant problem, Vance began. The program was supposed to remain completely compartmentalized. By revealing your affiliation in open court, you've compromised operational security. With respect, Director, my operational security was already compromised the moment I was subjected to an unauthorized psychiatric evaluation by someone without proper clearance. Vance's expression darkened. What psychiatric evaluation? Morgan described Dr. Parker's assessment, which had been introduced as evidence without her knowledge or consent. As she spoke, Vance's anger became increasingly evident. Captain, Dr. Parker has no security clearance above confidential. He has no authorization to evaluate Shadow Protocol personnel, and his report constitutes a massive security breach. That's what I suspected, ma'am. Someone wanted to destroy my credibility using information they obtained illegally. Vance stood and began pacing. Captain, there's something you need to know about Judge Sterling. 3 days ago, we received intelligence suggesting that he had been compromised by foreign intelligence services. His financial records show payments from shell companies linked to Iranian intelligence. The revelation hit Morgan like a physical blow. He's been working for the enemy? We believe so. The timing of your court-martial, the unauthorized psychiatric evaluation, the restrictions placed on your defense, it all fits a pattern designed to neutralize Shadow Protocol personnel by destroying their careers and credibility. How many others? You're the third Shadow Protocol operative to face court-martial in the past 6 months. The other 2 were convicted and are currently serving time in military prison. Morgan felt a cold rage building in her chest. They're systematically targeting us. Yes, and your decision to invoke Shadow Protocol may have saved not just your career, but the entire program. Vance opened another folder, revealing surveillance photos and intelligence reports. We've been building a case against Sterling for months, but we needed him to take an action that would provide definitive proof of his corruption. Your court-martial was a perfect trap. So I was bait? You were a patriot doing her duty, just as you always have. But yes, we hope that Sterling's handling of your case will provide the evidence we needed to expose his treachery. The conference room door opened, and General Wells entered with Admiral Jessica Morrison, a woman whose presence commanded immediate attention. Morrison's uniform bore decorations that spoke of a career at the very highest levels of military service. Captain Harrison, Morrison said, please remain seated. What you've endured over the past 3 days represents a failure of our system to protect the people who serve at the highest levels of classification. I'm here to personally apologize and to set the record straight. Morrison gestured to Vance, who produced another set of documents. Captain, your court-martial is hereby dismissed by direct order of the Secretary of Defense. All records of these proceedings are classified at the highest levels and will be permanently sealed. She paused, fixing Morgan with a direct gaze. Additionally, Judge Sterling has been arrested by military police on charges of treason, espionage, and conspiracy against the United States. Dr. Parker is also in custody for unauthorized disclosure of classified information. The weight of vindication was almost overwhelming, but Morgan maintained her military composure. What about the other Shadow Protocol operatives who were convicted? Their cases are being reviewed immediately. Based on what we've learned about Sterling's corruption, their convictions will likely be overturned and their records cleared. Admiral Morrison approached the conference table and withdrew a leather portfolio. Captain, I'm authorized to offer you several options regarding your future service. She opened a portfolio, revealing official documents bearing the highest classification markings. First option, you can accept a promotion to major and assignment to the Pentagon, where you would help develop new protocols to prevent this kind of compromise from happening again. Morgan listened carefully as Morrison outlined the alternatives. Second option, return to operational status with Shadow Protocol under enhanced security measures and oversight. And the third option? Morrison smiled for the first time. Create and command a new unit specifically designed to identify and neutralize threats to our special operations personnel. You would have complete autonomy in personnel selection and operational authority. Morgan considered the 3 choices, But her decision was already clear. I'll take the third option, Admiral, but I have conditions. Name them. I want complete access to the files of every Shadow Protocol operative who's been targeted. I want authority to investigate anyone in the chain of command who might be compromised. And I want the resources to ensure this never happens again. Morrison nodded approvingly. Granted. What do you want to call this new unit? Morgan thought of the 3 days she had spent watching Sterling systematically destroy her reputation while serving foreign interests. She thought of the other operatives who were sitting in military prison for crimes they didn't commit. She thought of the betrayal of trust that had nearly destroyed a program dedicated to protecting American lives. Echo vengeance, she said finally, because some betrayals demand a response. Morrison extended her hand. Welcome to your new command, Major Harrison. 6 months later, Major Morgan Harrison stood in a secure briefing room, an undisclosed location, addressing a team of 12 specially selected operatives. The unit patch on their uniforms bore the Echo Vengeance insignia, a stylized ghost emerging from shadows, representing the mission to protect those who served in darkness. Ladies and gentlemen, Morgan began, our mission is simple but critical. We identify, investigate, and neutralize threats to American Special Operations personnel. We are the hunters who protect the hunters. The team she had assembled represented the finest talents from across the military and intelligence communities. Each had been personally vetted by Morgan and had demonstrated both exceptional capability and unwavering loyalty to the Constitution. On the screen behind her, photos appeared of 17 individuals who had been identified as potential security threats. These are the people who betrayed our trust, sold our secrets, and endangered our operatives. Some are in foreign intelligence services. Others are American citizens who chose money over patriotism. She clicked to the next slide, showing a detention facility. Judge Sterling is currently serving a life sentence for treason. Dr. Parker received 25 years for espionage. But they were just the beginning of a network that extends throughout our military and intelligence communities. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim, Morgan's deputy, raised her hand. What's our operational authority, Major? We report directly to the Secretary of Defense through a compartmentalized chain of command. Our operations are classified at levels that don't officially exist. We have resources, authority, and legal cover to operate anywhere American Special Operations personnel might be threatened. Captain James Rodriguez, a former Army Ranger, asked the next question. Rules of engagement? Morgan's expression hardened. We protect our own by whatever means necessary. Some threats can be neutralized through legal channels. Others require more direct action. We adapt our methods to the situation. Over the following months, Echo Vengeance systematically dismantled a network that had targeted Shadow Protocol personnel. 3 foreign intelligence operatives were arrested. 2 Pentagon officials were convicted of selling classified information. 5 military officers were court-martialed for corruption. But the unit's most significant success came through prevention rather than punishment. By identifying and neutralizing threats before they could act, Echo Vengeance protected dozens of special operations personnel from the kind of systematic destruction that Morgan had barely survived. The work was dangerous, often operating in legal gray areas that required careful navigation of constitutional protections and international law. But it was also necessary, filling a gap in American security that had allowed enemies to target the nation's most valuable military assets. 1 year after her court-martial, Morgan received a secure message from General Wells, who had been promoted to head of military intelligence. Major, your unit's success rate is unprecedented. Echo Vengeance has become the gold standard for protecting special operations personnel. The president himself has taken notice. Morgan read the message in her office, surrounded by case files and intelligence reports that told the story of a systematic campaign to protect those who served in shadows. Through the window, she could see her team conducting training exercises, preparing for missions that would never appear in official records. She thought back to that moment in the courtroom when she had spoken 2 words that changed everything. Shadow Protocol had been more than just a call sign. It had been a declaration of identity, a claim to authority that transcended the corrupt proceedings designed to destroy her. Now, through Echo Vengeance, she was ensuring that other operatives would never face the same betrayal. The shadows that had once hidden America's enemies now conceal the protectors who hunted them. Justice had been served, not in a public courtroom with media attention and political theater, but in the quiet, deadly efficiency of professionals who understood that some fights couldn't be won through conventional means. The phone on her desk rang, a secure line that only activated for the highest priority missions. Morgan answered with the calm professionalism that had defined her entire career. "Echo Vengeance, Major Harrison." "Major, this is Director Vance. We have a situation developing in Eastern Europe. 3 Shadow Protocol operatives have gone missing, and we have reason to believe they've been compromised by the same network you've been hunting." Morgan was already reaching for her tactical gear before Vance finished speaking. "How long do we have?" "Unknown. The window for extraction is closing rapidly. Can Echo Vengeance deploy within 6 hours?" "We'll be wheels up in 4, Morgan replied, her mind already shifting into operational mode. "Send me everything you have on the situation." As she gathered her team and prepared for deployment, Morgan reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a defendant's chair in a corrupt courtroom to commanding a unit that protected America's most elite warriors, it had been a transformation forged in betrayal and tempered by justice. But the mission was never complete. There would always be new threats, new betrayals, new enemies who sought to destroy those who served in shadows. Echo Vengeance existed to ensure that such threats never succeeded, that the protectors had protectors of their own. The aircraft carrying Morgan's team lifted off into the darkness, beginning another mission that would never appear in official records. In the cargo bay, 12 of America's finest operators prepared for whatever awaited them in hostile territory, knowing that they served under a commander who understood the true cost of betrayal and the true meaning of loyalty. Far below, the lights of civilization faded into darkness, leaving only the mission ahead and the certainty that some fights were worth any sacrifice. Morgan Harrison had learned that truth in a courtroom where corruption had tried to destroy her. Now she lived that truth every day, ensuring that others would never face the same betrayal. The shadows that had once concealed her enemies now hid her team as they moved toward another battle in the endless war between those who served with honor and those who sold that honor for personal gain. In the end, justice wasn't about courtrooms or verdicts. It was about the quiet determination of professionals who refused to let betrayal go unanswered, who protected protectors, and who served in shadows so that others could live in light. Echo Vengeance had become the answer to every threat against America's special operations community. And Morgan Harrison, the officer who had once whispered 2 words that ended a corrupt judge's career, now commanded the shadows themselves in service of a cause greater than any individual recognition or career advancement. The mission continued, as it always would, until the last threat was neutralized and the last betrayal was answered. In the darkness between nations, where official rules didn't apply and conventional justice couldn't reach, Echo Vengeance maintained a balance that kept American warriors safe. And in that balance, Morgan Harrison had found her true calling, not as a defendant in a corrupt courtroom, but as a guardian of those who guarded the nation.